All right, this is Bava Metzia, Daf Kuf Yudalid Bebit. This is the last shir of this Masechta. This shir was actually given Shavuot night as part of the learning for Tikkun LaShavuot. And since we can't record on Shavuot, so I'm re-recording it now after the fact. This is the last, like I said, this is the last shir of this Masechta, and then we'll go to Bava Batra. And what the shir this week deals with is a conversation between Rabbi Bar Avua and Eliyahu Navi that's recorded in this week's shir. And essentially, it's a starting point for a broader discussion which concerns the Midrash in a lot of different places around which tribe was Eliyahu Navi from. Right? If we go back and reread the Psukim, so Eliyahu, he just appears out of ostensibly nowhere. It's not clear where he's from. It says he's Mitoshavei Gilad. But other than that, who was he? How did he have the authority that he had to just stop the rain? And he becomes a clear authority figure with a lot of power, but we don't really know who he is. Was he some fringe prophet who was out on the fringe of society? Was he someone who was more central? These are the questions that the Midrash are going to try to deal with. One of the topics that will come up is a famous question about how Eliyahu could also have offered a korban on Har Carmel in the famous battle with the Nivei Baal, because he lived at a time when there was a Beit Mikdash, and we know about Mot or Asur. So this is something that we'll also see some of the Midrashim address, albeit in an indirect way. And we'll see how different Midrashim actually seem to be in tension with each other and offer different approaches to which tribe Eliyahu was from. And then we'll kind of conclude with perhaps the most famous version of this tradition, which is that Eliyahu actually was identical with Pinchas, the grandson of Aaron Kohen, and try to understand how that developed and became the dominant explanation for who Eliyahu was. Okay, so let's begin. Gemara in the Bava Metzia, Daf Kuf Yudalid Bebit says as follows: Ashkechei Rabbi Bar Avua Eliyahu dekai bebeit הקברות של גויים. Okay, so Rabbi Bar Avua found Eliyahu, who was just wandering around in a graveyard of non-Jews. And then there's a discussion between Rabbi Bar Avua and Eliyahu of various halachic questions. And then during that discussion, Rabbi Bar Avua asked the following: Amalei lav Kohen umar my time kai mar bebeit הקברות. So Rabbi Bar Avua says to Eliyahu, "Aren't you a Kohen? Isn't the master a Kohen? So what are you doing in the graveyard?" Right? We know that Kohanim are not allowed in the graveyard. Because Kohanim are not allowed to become impure or be in contact with dead bodies. So Amarle lo matne marta rot the Tanya Rishon ben Chai Omer kivrein shenochim en metamin shenemar v'aten sonit son mariti Adam atem kurin Adam ve'enochim kurin Adam. So Eliyahu, in astonishment, asked Rabbi Bar Avua, "Haven't you learned the halachot of Talmud? Right? Don't you know that only the bodies of Jews are metame not through touch, but through oil, right? Being in the same complex. The bodies of non-Jews, right? The halacha is that there's three ways that tumah can be imparted from a body: magam, masa, and oil, which is touching or carrying, and then being in the same under the same roof. So Jewish bodies are metame all three. Non-Jewish bodies are only magam, masa, but not ohel. Why not ohel? So this is the teaching of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai that Eliyahu quotes, that the pasuk says Adam, but non-Jews are not referred to as Adam. So regardless, this is the halacha l'maaseh, is that we pass on the Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, even though it's a da'at yachid in this case, that non-Jewish bodies do not convey tumat ohel. So Eliyahu Navi says back to Rabbi Bar Avua, "What are you asking me? Why I'm allowed to be in the graveyard? This is a graveyard of non-Jewish bodies, and non-Jewish bodies do not transmit tum'ah in that way, so it's not a problem." The Gemara continues and says, "Amarle ba'arba'a lo matzina b'shita matzina." So Rabbi Avua says back to Eliyahu, "You want me to be proficient in all six of these darim? Right? I barely know four of them. Right? I don't have time to even learn four. Tarot is one of the most obscure and esoteric and difficult ones. So how do you expect me to know that?" So Amarle, so he asked back to him, "Vamai, why don't you have time to learn four or even six darim of the Mishnah?" So Amarle, he said back to him, "Dechika li milta." So he said, because it's hard for me to make a living. Right, I have to work hard in order to provide for my family, and so I'm pressed to make a living, and therefore I don't have the time to learn as best as I can, or what I should know. So what does Eliyahu say to him? So he says the following. So he took him out and he brought him up to Gan Eden. Eliyahu brought Rabbi Bar to Gan Eden. Amar Lei said to him, take off your coat. So take some of the leaves from Gan Eden and gather them up in your coat. So Safar Shakal, he did that. When he was leaving with some of these leaves, so Shama de Ka'amar Man Ka Achil Almi Baravua. He heard a voice go out from Gan Eden, said, has anyone ever seen anyone who consumes their portion in the world to come like Rabbi Baravua does? In the sense that for he's taking his reward by taking these leaves out of Gan Eden, and he's sacrificing the reward in the world to come through doing that. So Nafat Shedinu. So then he shook out his coat and he threw the leaves away because he didn't want to do that. But even so, his coat still maintained, even though he left without the leaves in his coat. He left Gan Eden empty-handed, but his coat still maintained the scent, the smell of the leaves of Gan Eden. And so he was able to still sell his coat for a nice amount. It's 12,000 dinarim, and he divided up that money amongst his family, amongst his son-in-laws. And so he still benefited from this, even though he didn't take the leaves, and he still kept his portion in the world to come. Okay, so the part that interests us, of course, is the story of Eliyahu Navi, right? If we try to understand what the claim that the Gemara is making, right? So if we just kind of break it down step by step, Bava Baravua finds him in a graveyard of non-Jews. He says to him, how can you be in this graveyard? Aren't you a Kohen? And Kohanim are not allowed to be in a graveyard. So Eliyahu says to him, don't you know that Kohanim are allowed to be in a graveyard of non-Jews? Or that there's no prohibition to be in a graveyard of non-Jews. So what does Eliyahu Navi's response imply? Right? If Eliyahu was not a Kohen, wouldn't it have been a simpler answer to say, I'm not a Kohen? It's true that even if he were a Kohen, he still would be allowed to be in the graveyard. But since Rabbi Baravua says, aren't you a Kohen? Why are you wandering around the graveyard? If he wasn't a Kohen, the simplest answer would just be, I'm not a Kohen. And that wouldn't contradict the answer that he gives, which is that it's not a problem. But the answer of it's not a problem seems to imply that he is a Kohen. And that's why he's giving the answer of it's not a problem for a Kohen, even for a Kohen, to be in a graveyard like this. So it seems pretty clear that although it's not explicit, Eliyahu here is strongly implying that he is a Kohen in this story. In contrast, if we go to Bereshit Rabbah, Perek Ayin Aleph, Mishnah Tet, it says as follows: Eliyahu Mishalmi. Which tribe was Eliyahu Navi from? Rabbi Eliezer Amar Mishal Binyamin. Dichtiv ve'Shreya ve'Eliyahu v'Zichri b'nei Rucham Kol Elen b'nei Binyamin. A pasuk from Divrei Yamim. Rabbi Eliezer quotes it and says, we see from here that Eliyahu is listed amongst the descendants of Binyamin, so he was from the tribe of Binyamin. Rabbi Norai Amar Mishal Gad Haya, but Rabbi Norai argues with him and says he's from Shevet Gad. Perhaps the simplest understanding that he was from the Toshavim of Gilad, and that Gilad was in the portion of Gad, and therefore Eliyahu Tishbi was from that section, that tribe of Gad. Okay, so we have machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Norai. Was he from Binyamin or from Gad? Amar Rabbi Filipi bar Nehorai, man chazit lememar ken. Amar lei dichtiv v'eilan gvul yazeh v'chol arei Gilad. Okay, and so then there's a back and forth. How do you know that? And so the Arei Gilad is in the tribe of Gad. Okay, then the Midrash continues. So it says, once the rabbis were actively in the Beit Midrash arguing about this question, they say from one, they say from the other. Bava Metzia. So Eliyahu himself came and appeared before them. So Eliyahu says, what are you arguing about me? I am from the descendants of Rachel. So what does that mean? I'm from the descendants of Rachel. Well, Rachel had two children. She had Yosef and she had Binyamin, right? And in terms of tribes, it's Ephraim, Menashe, and Binyamin. The implication is, since they're arguing, was he from Gad or Binyamin, that when Eliyahu comes and says, why are you guys arguing? Don't you know that I'm from the descendants of Rachel? That he's saying that I'm from Shevet Binyamin. Again, it's similar in what we saw earlier in the Gemara in the sense that it's not explicit and it could be interpreted to mean that he's from Ephraim or Menashe, and he's not agreeing with either one of the opinions quoted earlier. But the simplest understanding is certainly that he's agreeing with Rabbi Eliezer and saying that he was from Shevet Binyamin. Okay? But regardless, no matter what, Bereshit Rabbah has to argue on Bava Metzia in this sense, because Rabbi Eliezer says it's from Binyamin, Rabbi Norai says it's from Gad. Okay, he himself, Eliyahu himself, says, I am from the descendants of Rachel. So if I understand in Bava Metzia, Eliyahu himself, B'chvodo ve'atzmo, when he is accused or he is claimed to be a Kohen from Shevet Levi, of course, he doesn't say that's not the case. He actually seems to strongly imply that is the case. But Levi was a child of Leah. So when he says, Ani mibnei banei shel Rachel ani, it's pretty clear that Bereshit Rabbah is arguing on Bava Metzia. Okay. If we move on to Shmot Rabbah, in Perek Mem, we find a different tradition. Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, Eliyahu Yerushalmi haya, u'miyoshvei lishkat hagazit haya, u'mikrach shel Yehuda haya, u'vishnei shvatim haya chelko, 5 b'Binyamin, v'shlosha b'Yehuda. So, there's a lot to unpack here. Right? It says Eliyahu was a Yerushalmi, he was from Yerushalayim, and he was one of the members of the Sanhedrin. He was Yoshvei Lishkat HaGazit, which is a way of saying one of the 70 elders of the Sanhedrin. And he came from one of the villages in the portion of Yehuda. And his portion was actually in 2 places, divided among 2 tribes. Right? 5/8 of it was from Binyamin, and then 3/8 of it was from Yehuda. So his portion was divided between the tribes of Binyamin and Yehuda, but it's a slight majority from Binyamin. But he himself was originally from Yerushalayim. He was one of the members of the Sanhedrin, and he was from a village of Yehuda. And then the Midrash just continues. He had 4 names. Which is the pasuk that we saw in Bereshit Rabbah to prove that he was from Shevet Binyamin, because Eliyahu is one of the 4. So this, again, seems to support that he was actually from Binyamin. So even though it says he was from a Krach Shel Yehuda, from a village of Yehuda, but his portion was majority from Binyamin, and so here we see that he actually was from Shevet Binyamin. Why was he called Eliyahu? When HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to shake or quake the world, that's why it's Bnei Yerucham. Bnei Yerucham is from Rachamim. Okay. So what is motivating this Midrash in Shmot Rabbah? Where is it getting that Eliyahu was a Yerushalmi and that he was from the Sanhedrin? What is it talking about? So perhaps we can get a bit of a clue from a famous Gemara Yuma Daf Yud Ben Amud Aleph, which teaches the following. It's in the context of a discussion of whether Yerushalayim was nitchalka l'shvatim or not. Right? When the Eretz Yisrael was conquered originally in the days of Yeshua, so the land was divided up into different tribes. The question is, which tribe merited to have the Beit HaMikdash in it? Because that's clearly a big zchut. And it's a machloket between Tanaim. So the Gemara in Yuma says the following: "B'maika mifligi Tana kama savar Yerushalayim lo nitchalka l'shvatim." So one opinion held that Yerushalayim was not divided up, similar to Lahavdil, Washington D.C. in the United States, where the capital is not within one of the states. It's not within one of the tribal portions. It's kind of no man's land. It's its own place that isn't allocated to any particular tribe. But Rabbi Yehuda actually held that Yerushalayim was divided up amongst the tribes. There's a Braita that teaches the following. What parts of the Beit HaMikdash were in Yehuda's portion in Eretz Yisrael? Beit, Lishkaot, Ve'azarot. Okay, so the actual Beit was in Yehuda's portion, and then the courtyards and various parts of the Beit HaMikdash. And what was in Binyamin's portion? Ulam ve'echal Beit Kodshei HaKodashim. The inner parts of the Beit HaMikdash. So Yehuda had the outer parts, the Beit and the courtyards, and then Binyamin had the inner parts, which is kind of the main hall, the Ulam and the Echal, and then the actual Kodesh Kodashim, where all the kelim were, essentially, where all the different utensils in the inner part of the Beit HaMikdash were. That was in Binyamin's section. So essentially we find that Beit was divided, the Beit HaMikdash was divided between the Shvatim of Yehuda and Binyamin, with Binyamin getting the inner holier parts, and Yehuda getting the outer parts surrounding it. And then the Braita continues and says the following: ונכנסת לחלקו של בנימין, ובה היה מזבח בנוי. So we said, the different kelim, the utensils of the Mishkan were in the portion of Binyamin, right? The Ulam and the Echam. But it qualifies and says, Yehuda, his, you imagine on a map, like the cartography of the tribes and how they interlocked with each other. So the border of Yehuda's portion had a strip that came out, or it popped out like this long strip and kind of enclosed around the Mizbeach of the Beit HaMikdash. So that was actually included in Yehuda's portion and not in Binyamin's portion. U'Binyamin HaTzadik, היה מסתר עליה, הלבלה בכל יום. And Binyamin HaTzadik, the implication being the original Binyamin Saba, the son of Yaakov Avinu. So he somehow knew that this was going to be the case, that the altar, the Mizbeach, would not be in his portion, and it bothered him every day. And he wanted the Mizbeach in his portion. Shneimar chofef alav kol hayom. This is the bracha that Moshe Rabbeinu gives to Binyamin at the end of his life, Shevet Binyamin. It says chofef alav kol hayom, which is interpreted here midrashically to mean that he's worried about and thinking about the Mizbeach all day. Is that because he did that, that's taken to be something that's good, and he's rewarded for it. That Hashem dwells between his shoulders, meaning that the Kodesh HaKodashim is in the portion of Binyamin, and Hashem's Shekhinah is really concentrated there, and it's in between the shoulders of Binyamin, in the sense that the topology of Har Beit and the mountains there, that Hashem's actually dwells within the portion of Shevet Binyamin and the Kodesh HaKodashim. But again, we see here there's this idea of Yerushalayim Nitchalka Shvatim, and specifically divided between Shevet Yehuda, which has some claim to the Har Beit, David HaMelech, of course, and Shlomo HaMelech, but also that Shevet Binyamin had some claim to Har Beit, and indeed the Shevet Binyamin seems to have a slightly more, he's the primary claim, that he has the intersections of the Beit HaMikdash. So if we take this and we apply it back to what we saw in Shemot Rabbah, so Eliyahu is described as being B'shnei Shvatim ha'echelko, Chamisha v'Binyamin, Shlosha v'Yehuda. This parallels very nicely the Gemara we see in Yuma, that there's some parts of Har Bayit that were in Shevet Yehuda, some parts in Binyamin, and Binyamin was the greater one. And so what this is effectively doing then, if it wasn't clear already from saying that Eliyahu was from Yerushalayim and that he lived in the Sanhedrin, or he was a member of the Sanhedrin, was that, going back to the question we raised in the beginning when introducing the Shiur, that Eliyahu appears out of nowhere. It's not clear who he is. He doesn't have any relatives, any ties. He's impossible to find. What's his story? Who was he? And so Shemot Rabbah says, lest you think he's some, wild, off the radar type of personality. It's the opposite. He was as mainstream as it gets. He was from the center of the accepted way of things, that he was a member of the Sanhedrin, that he was part of the Beit HaMikdash, that he, as it were, is the ultimate paradigm of, the ritualistic, the halachot of Beit HaMikdash, and how you have to sacrifice there, and how everything is centered around the Makom HaSheivcha Hashem. So this is clearly meant to be addressing what we asked in the beginning as well, around how was Eliyahu allowed to go and build Bamot in Har Carmel in the north, right? Which, of course, the answer given there is that it was the Tzorach Sha'ah, that you're allowed to a Navi is allowed to suspend the Mitzvah Taseh for the sake of the greater good in a particular situation. So Eliyahu was allowed to offer a korban there because it was about maintain or bringing the Jewish people back from the brink in Malchut Yisrael at least. But that doesn't mean that he was not part of the mainstream the leaders of the Jewish people of the day. The opposite, on the contrary, and he was divided between Yehuda and Binyamin. So perhaps the argument back in Bereshit Rabbah of what was he from Gad or Binyamin, we could suggest in some sense is also revolving around this question, because the opinion that says he's from Shevet Gad ties it to Vayomer Eliyahu Tishbi Mitoshvei Gilad. The only description that we have in the Pshat about where Eliyahu was from is right when he appears. So he comes from Shevet Gad. What it's essentially saying is there's no more to Eliyahu than what meets the eye from the Pshat, in the sense that He was from, Gad, which was, first of all, on the other side of the Yarden. And now that we mention it now, so it's something that just popped into my head, right? The Reuven Gad Chatzisha Menashe means that he's from the other side of the Yarden if he's from Shevet Gad. Right? He's really on from the other side. He's removed. Ever Anar. So that makes Eliyahu certainly not, but he's not part of Malchut Yisrael. He's certainly not part of the Beit HaMikdash. But the other opinion, which says he was from Shevet Binyamin, so it's trying to argue the opposite point, that Chas v'Chalila, that Eliyahu would be from Shevet Gad, and that he's not even from the mainland of Eretz Yisrael, either Malchut Yudah, Malchut Yisrael. That no, Eliyahu was a central figure of the day, an accepted figure, an authority figure, and he wasn't this person from Shevet Gad that didn't have any connection to kind of the ruling leaders of his time. Okay. Let's continue. If we move to Tanat Ve'Eliyahu Rabbah, which is a midrash written in around the 8th, 9th century CE, and it's attributed to Eliyahu himself, or to his school. And a lot of the Mishnayot in Tanat Ve'Eliyahu are authored in the first person, where Eliyahu talks about himself in the first person. And so we'll learn now in Perek Yudchet, Mishnah Mem Tet, an example, which is a parallel to the discussion that we saw in Bereshit Rabbah. פעם אחת היו רבותינו שאר חכמים יושבים בבית המדרש והיו חולקים זה עם זה. ואמרו, היכן אליהו בא? So one time the rabbis are sitting in the Midrash, they're arguing and trying to understand where did Eliyahu Hanavi come from. זהו ממזרעה של רחל וזהו ממזרעה של לאה. So one opinion said he was from Rachel's offspring, another opinion said he was from Leah's offspring. Now this could either mean the Zarah shel Rachel is Binyamin, Zarah shel Leah. So actually, I take it back, right? Gad was not for Zarah shel Leah, right? Gad was from Gad Asher Chazulon, Dan Naftali, Gad Asher was from Bilha. I believe Gad was from Bilha, right? From Rachel's maidservant. So Gad was not a child of Leah or Rachel. So if in Tanat Eliyahu it's arguing about whether Eliyahu was from Rachel or Leah, so it's not entertaining the possibility that he's from Gad. What then makes more sense? Mizrah shel Rachel, as we saw, is most likely Shevet Binyamin. But what's Mizrah shel Leah? So the opinion that we saw was the one in Bava Metzia, right, with Rabbi Baravua, that Levi was one of the offspring of Leah, and that would mean that he was a Kohen. So ostensibly that's what they're arguing about here, Binyamin or a Kohen. And so the Mishnah, so it continues. It says, "Ad shecholkin zein zeh bati alehen v'amati lifnehen." So Eliyahu testifies. He says they're arguing, so I came before them. V'amati lifnehen v'amarti. I said to them, "Rabbi Isai, ein ani ba ela mizrah shel Rachel." I'm from Shevet Binyamin. So in this sense, he is machriya. He concludes that he's from Binyamin, similar to how in Bereshit Rabbah he sees them arguing about Binyamin and Gad, and he comes and he says, "I am from Bnei Vanei shel Rachel." Where we said before that most likely means Binyamin, and here it explicitly says that he says, I'm from Shevet Binyamin. And it continues, V'amruli ten siman devarecha. So they said to me, Eliyahu says, prove it. He quotes the pasuk that we've seen several times from Binyamin. And now a new thing. V'amruli, the rabbi said back to me, V'lo Kohen ata, aren't you a Kohen? How can you say you're from Shevet Binyamin? ולא כך אמרת לאישה אלמנה, אך עשי לי משם עוגה קטנה בראשונה, והוצאת לי ולך ולבנך תעשי באחרונה. So there's a story in Melachim Aleph, Perek Yud Zayin, when Eliyahu goes to the house of a woman who is a widow and has a young child, and Eliyahu says to her, can I please have something to eat and something to drink? And she says, all I have is this one small thing, and Eliyahu does a miracle, right, with the oil, kind of reminds us of Chanukah, where he says the oil will overflow and the jug will keep overflowing and it won't run out. And that way, even though you're poor, if you provide to me, then that blessing, that Hashem will provide a blessing and you'll be able to survive off of that. But the language in the pasuk is strange. He says very specifically, first provide to me, and then you and your child should eat. So why would Eliyahu insist that first she has to give him something and only then does she and her son get to benefit from this miracle, from this blessing? So the assumption here, V'lav kohenata, why do the rabbis who are arguing with Eliyahu say, doesn't that prove that you're a Kohen? Why would that prove that he's a Kohen? Because it's hafashat chala, or truma, or some gift, that the reason why Eliyahu would insist this poor woman on the brink of starvation has to give him before taking for herself and her son, must be that Eliyahu was a Kohen. If he was a Kohen, he has to receive first. And so isn't that a proof of that? Eliyahu himself then concludes and rejects that and says, Amarti lahen, I said to them, Otot tinok ben Yosef haya, v'remez ramazti la'olam sh'niyoret chila bebavel v'achar kach yavo ben David. Without getting into the details of what his answer is, but it's around Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben David, the child was the Mashiach ben Yosef. But essentially, Eliyahu says the reason I insist on taking first had nothing to do with the halachic requirement of a Rashad Chala or anything like that. Rather, I was making a broader point about the Acharit Yamim. Okay, so Eliyahu rejects that he's a Kohen with this interesting new proof that we saw from Malachim, and insists that he's from Shevet Binyamin, seeming to go against our original Gemara Bava Metzia. If we look in the Abarbanel and his perush on that story of Isha Tzarfatit in Melachim Aleph, so he just notes V'tziva ota shetaseh la barishona. Eliyahu commanded her to make for him first Uga ktana mipnei oto ra'ev v'tzameh min haderech, because he was hungry. V'gam lefi shemipnei kalkalto yavi Hashem yitbarach al bracha b'kemach u'v'shemen hahu. And then Abarbanel explains, because Eliyahu wanted to bring down, the influence and blessing from above, from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So in order to do that, in order to achieve that, if she were to take it first, she would use up whatever little oil or flour she had left. There wouldn't be anything left for the bracha to take effect on, versus if Eliyahu took first. So because Eliyahu was a Navi, and he had the power to bring down this Shefa Elokit, so then if she gave him first, it would then allow for the miracle to take place. That's why I insisted on doing it first, according to the Abarbanel. But then the Abarbanel notes, V'chachamenu zichronon levracha amru, shehu haya Eliyahu Pinchas. Eliyahu was Pinchas. V'leto Kohen tziva shtotzi lo chala barishona min ha'isa. Eliyahu was Pinchas, meaning he was a Kohen, and that this was in order to give him Hafashat Chala, because he was a Kohen, he needed to get first. Which is what we actually interestingly saw in Tan of Eliyahu, is Eliyahu himself says, I'm not a Kohen, I'm not Pinchas, I'm from Shevet Binyamin, and he rejects this explanation that Abarbanel says, Chazal said, Eliyahu is Pinchas, and then this is taken as a proof. Not the Mashiach ben Yosef, but rather that this is actually proof that he was a Kohen. So, okay, let's wrap up now by Eliyahu was Pinchas. So what's that about? Pirkei Eliezer Mem Zayin. Eliezer Omer, Kara Shemo shel Pinchas b'shmo Eliyahu. Eliyahu zachur latov mitoshavei Gilad, she'asa Yisrael tshuva behar Gilad. V'natan HaKadosh Baruch Hu zachar tov v'livanav v'tzadikim numan kunat olam shenemar v'etelo zarvar v'charav brit kunat olam. Right? Why does it say that he was from mitoshavei Gilad? That he had been able to do tshuva. It's a play on words. Toshavei Gilad, tshuva, and har Gilad. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him a reward. Similar to how Pinchas received a eternal reward for bringing Bnei Yisrael back from being led astray. So, of course, what's going on here is two things, and we won't dwell on this too much. Right? The first thing, which is simple, is that Pinchas was a zealot. Right? He was a kanai. Right? What he did when with the Zimri and Kozbi, that he stabbed them, even though Moshe and all the other elders were crying and paralyzed, didn't know what to do. Eliyahu stood up and took action. Pinchas stood up and took action. And Eliyahu similarly is a zealot, right? Kano kiniti Hashem u'ketzvakot is what he says in his vision at Har Chorev, Har Sinai. And so they're both these, zealous personalities, and so the Midrash is connecting them and saying they're actually identical. But the second thing of what gives it the license to do this, again, we won't go into the details here, is that at the end of Sefer Shoftim, in the story of Pilegish Begiva, there's a pasuk which says that Pinchas was alive at that time. Pinchas was functioning during the days of Pilegish Begiva. Now the problem is the story of Pilegish Begiva is at the end of Sefer Shoftim. Parkim Yudchet, Kav Chav Aleph. So if you take Sefer Shoftim to be chronological, it means that Pinchas, must have lived for hundreds of years, because he was alive in the days of the desert, obviously, and then hundreds of years passed between Bnei Yisrael going into Eretz Yisrael, the time of Yoshua, which is 28 years, I believe, but then hundreds of years of all the Shoftim that are described. So what do we do about that? So there's two things that we can do. One is, as suggested in certain Midrashim like Seder Lamaba, is to suggest that Sefer Shoftim is written out of order, chronological order that is. And the story of Pilegish Begiva happened at the beginning of Sefer Shoftim. And so Pinchas, who was on the younger side at the end of the 40 years in the desert, could have lived through during the time of Yoshua, at the beginning of Sefer Shoftim. He was already older, but he was still alive and lived a normal lifespan. And that's why he's mentioned as being alive during Pilegesh B'Giva. The obvious question then is, why would Sefer Shoftim put it at the end if it happened chronologically hundreds of years earlier in the beginning? And the answer given there is that Sefer Shoftim is written to teach not a history lesson in terms of chronology, but a moral message around the degradation of Bnei Yisrael, about the slow descent into anarchy, madness, and sin of the people, because they didn't have a king. And so the Pilegesh B'Giva was the pinnacle of that. So even if it happened chronologically first, it's the worst story of all the stories, and so thematically it makes sense to put it at the end. That's one approach. But the other approach is to say, no, it's written in the order that things happened, and Pilegesh B'Giva happened at the end, which actually makes sense, to juxtapose the Sefer Shmuel, which comes next, because Shaul is from Shev Binyamin, and they're almost wiped out in the story of Pilegesh B'Giva. So putting that at the end, there's kind of things in Sefer Shmuel that make sense given that juxtaposition. But the problem then is, how could Pinchas be alive hundreds of years after the desert? So you can say that he just lived for a very, very long time, a miraculous lifespan of hundreds of years. And if I'm running saying that, it gives me license to extend his life from the end of Sefer Shoftim well into Sefer Melachim, hundreds more years, and identify him as Eliyahu. Let's just conclude. We'll skip the Yalkut Shimoni here on the source sheet. It basically says the same thing. But let's conclude with this final Gemara here in Bava Metzia and Kuf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph. Tana Rabbanan Shiv'a Kiplu et Kol Olam Kulo. There were 7 people whose lifespans extended from the beginning of time to the end of time. Metushelach Ra'a Adam, Shem Ra'a Metushelach, Yaakov Ra'a Shem, Amram Ra'a Yaakov, Achia Shoni Ra'a Amram, Eliyahu Ra'a Achia Shoni, Ve'adayin Kayam. So, who are the 7 people? Right, Adam Rishon was the first person at the beginning of creation. Metushelach, who was Noach's grandfather, overlapped and saw Adam Rishon. Yaakov saw Shem, Noach's son, saw Metushelach. Yaakov saw Shem. Amram saw Yaakov. Achia Shiloni saw Amram. The Gemara there says, how do we know this? And it says it's a tradition that Achia Shiloni lived for a long time. He was alive in the lifespan of Yaakov Avinu. Right? Even though Achia Shiloni lives in the time of Yeravim ben Nevat, which is, again, hundreds and hundreds of years later. But we have a Masorah, a Gemara, that Achia Shiloni was alive in the time when Ben Yisrael went down to Mitzrayim, and saw Amram, Moshe's father. And then Eliyahu saw Achia Shiloni, and Eliyahu never died. So that's 7 people whose lifespan spanned all time. Tosfot, in his commentary on this Gemara, notes the following. V'hai Tana lo svir Eliyahu ze Pinchas. It must be that whoever taught this teaching did not believe that Eliyahu was Pinchas. Deimita lema Moshe ra'a Amram, Pinchas ra'a Moshe, v'adayin hu kayam, v'lo yitztarich le'achia klal. Why does it say 7 span the whole lifespan of the world? It could say 6. I shouldn't need Achia Shiloni if I say that Pinchas, who saw Moshe and saw Amram, Moshe saw Amram, and Pinchas clearly saw Moshe, and if Pinchas is Eliyahu, that's it, you're good. Pinchas, from the time of the Dor Midbar, you have someone who spans the rest of time, because Pinchas was Eliyahu and then he never died. So the fact that this Braita doesn't go there must imply that it didn't hold that Eliyahu was Pinchas. Just to conclude, this teaching that Eliyahu was Pinchas, right? We said this is perhaps the most famous identification. But most people, there isn't even common knowledge about what we saw in Bereshit Rabbah and in Tanakh Eliyahu, that there's a machloket. Maybe he was from Binyamin, or maybe he was from Shevet Gad. There's just this assumption. Not only was, of course, he was a Kohen, but that he was a specific Kohen, Eliyahu Navi. Right? First of all, that there are other opinions in the Midrash. And this identification of him as a Kohen we saw in Bava Metzia already throughout Baravua, which was written in the Tkufat al-Amoraim, let's say in the 300s and the 400s CE, that he was a Kohen. But the idea that he was identical to Pinchas is a Midrash, to the best of my knowledge, I could be mistaken, of course, but from the Midrashim that I was able to see, this idea first pops up in Midrashim that are only written later. In the times we saw it in Pirkei Eliezer, which is in the 800 CE, it's a few hundred years after the Gemara, and after Bereshit Rabbah, which is from the times of the Tanaim. So perhaps this idea that not only was he a Kohen, he was Eliyahu, was a later development of the Midrash. And so then when Tosfot says, it seems clear that the one who taught in Tana Rabbanan, right, which is from the Braita, which is in the times of the Mishnah, the Tanaim, 200s, 100s, 200s CE, that 7 people spanned the entire world, So Tosfot says it can't be that whoever authored that believed that Eliyahu was Pinchas. Perhaps we could suggest that could be, among other reasons, because he didn't even know that was a possibility, in the sense that the whole idea of Eliyahu being Pinchas perhaps was a midrashic development on top of him being a Kohen that only happened later after the Tkufa of the Tanaim. So after the Tana Rabbanan, and therefore this idea that Eliyahu was Pinchas wasn't even an option to reject in the midrashic literature. But perhaps him being a Kohen was, at the time, as we saw with Rabbi Baravu already at the times of the Amorim, that's a bit more plausible. But he, regardless, he rejects that, and he says Achia Shiloni was alive from the times of Yaakov Avinu until the times of Eliyahu Hanavi. Shkoyach.